Madam President, I rise to make my contribution to the bill that is presently before this Honorable House, the Integrity in Public Life Amendment Bill 2023. And, Madam President, you know, we ought not to have been here. We really ought not to have been here dealing with this amendment. I would say this, Madam President, that elections have consequences. Let me say that again. Elections have consequences, Madam President. And I want to say to the good people of St. James's, Nevis number 4, that I do not believe, Madam President, that when they went to the polls on the 12th of December and elected the member of the Nevis Reformation Party, that they would have thought that we would have been in Parliament dealing with the consequence of that election and the confusion that has been created, Madam President. Madam President, I agree with the Premier, you know, or the member for Nevis number 2, that this is as a result of a failure of leadership. And Madam President, Yuval Noah Harari is an Israeli author, public intellectual, a historian, and a professor in the Department of History at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And in an interview, Madam President, recently on MSNBC, the good professor states, and I quote, "Peace is based on compromise." Peace, Madam President, is based on compromise. Now, over the last year, Madam President, we have seen the kind of war, literal war, that has taken place between the members opposite. Why? They are not prepared to compromise. Failure of leadership. Madam President, we ought not to have been here. We ought not to have been here. Madam President, the member for number 4, and I asked my colleague, I whisper to my colleagues, please let me go after her. You know, let me speak after her. The member for Nevis number 4 stated that when this ordinance came into being in 2013, or passed in this House, there was no leader of the opposition. I hope I quoted you right. Was that a correct statement? You can't recall. Well, I wrote it down. Madam President, in 2013, who was the members opposite on the other side? Who? There was a leader of opposition in 2013, you know, Madam President. There was a leader of the opposition in 2013. And Madam President, it shows, Madam President, that it is because of the member opposite lack of history and knowledge and understanding of her own very party. She does not realize, or she did not realize, that in 2013, the former member, or the previous former member for number 4 was the leader of the opposition. Number 5, sorry, was the leader of the opposition. Supported by, what's his name? Elhansville Roberto Hector. They were in Parliament on that side when this legislation was passed in this Honorable House.
Madam President, point of order regarding the ordinance that was passed in 2013 but was not brought into force until 2018 when there was no appointed leader of the opposition in the Nevis Island Assembly. Thank you.
Madam President, my argument and my point is that when this ordinance was passed in this honorable house, there was a leader of the opposition supported by another member on the opposition side. When it came into force, that's a different story, and we can have that conversation. The point I am making, Madam President, is that the then leader and the then former representative of St. Paul's could have took this legislation and tore it to shreds. But what? It was passed in Parliament. So what is the argument? Madam President, the member opposite stated that the commission is not, that we are blaming her that the commission is not constituted because of NRP. We're not blaming her, it's a fact. It is a fact. The member for number 2, Madam President, went through how one becomes the leader of the opposition and the entire process. And he did it eloquently, Madam President. Well, who is on the opposition side? CCM can be on both sides. We are on the government side, they are on the opposition side. When this parliament was constituted after the December 12th election, there were 2 members opposite from the NRP. So who are we to blame? Well, now we have one. Because of the failure of leadership, the other one have summarily been asked to leave the NRP. Madam President. Madam President, I listened in amazement, and the member for number 4 said that this ordinance shows a lack of consideration for the people of Nevis. I took some notes. Lack of consideration for the people of Nevis. You know, Madam President, it could have been very easy for us to say that we don't have a leader of the opposition, so leave the integrity in public life on the shelf.
Maybe that's what they want.
We could have done that, you know. We could have said, no leader, they can't agree, they can't come to an agreement as to who they so leave the. But no, we said no, this is too important, Madam President, to the island and to the people of leadership. Lack of consideration. Madam President, it is because of the consideration that we have for the people of Nevis that we are seeking to do what they can't do. That is what we are here for. They can't agree. Madam President, it is amazing. It is amazing that the honorable member for number 4 have said, she used the language that this is the laughing stock. And Madam President, I don't like the idea of people laughing after me because it is not a good feeling. But that was the language that the honorable member for Nevis number 4 used in Parliament. That this ordinance have becoming, putting us to be the laughing stock. Madam President, I received a very interesting telephone call from a friend of mine in Jamaica. And very good friend. I cannot repeat what was said in Parliament, Madam President, but let me summarize. The long and the short of it was that the members on the opposition side need to understand that they play a pivotal and a critical role in democracy. If there is anybody, Madam President, who is making this Parliament a laughing stock, let them look on that side of the house. Let them look on that side of the house. Because, Madam President, on the 12th of December, we had an election. They won 2 seats, And shortly after, they lose one seat, and then all hell break loose. If that is parliamentary language, Madam President. And you can correct me.
It's a real place.
Sorry?
Hell is a real place.
I know that. But Madam President, Madam President, the member for number 5 made a statement in Parliament, some people, how do you think about it? Charge you, Minister? Some people come and so. Huh? Do I need to repeat it, Madam President? That is why we are here. The Constitution, Madam President, provides for a leader of the opposition. And there are times, Madam President, when it is silent on certain situations and circumstances. But I believe, Madam President, that the framers of the Constitution gave a clear indication of the importance of the leader of the opposition. And for the life of me, Madam President, you hear what Mr. Harari said? Peace is based on compromise. I sit in a cabinet, Madam President. I have a constituency to represent, and I have to compromise at times. I don't get everything that I want. The member for number 3 don't get everything he wants. The leader of the government and premier don't always get everything he wants. The 2 junior, they don't get everything that they want. And we have to wrestle at times, Madam President, for what it is that we don't always get it. But does that mean that we must mash up the thing? Does that mean we must destroy the whole thing, Madam President? Because we don't get our way? Well, that too. Huh? It's like, Madam President, you have a house. You have a window that is not in the best of condition. What you going to do? Knock down the whole house instead of replacing the window and say that the house is not good because the window is damaged? Madam President, that is what has happened here. That is what has happened here. And I want to say to the people of number 4, I believe that after the 12th of December, 2022, some would have reflected and some would have had deep introspection as to what would have transpired. I want to give them a little message, Madam President. I guarantee them that if the former member of Nevis number 4 was in this parliament, we would not have been here. We would not have been here. There would not have been this kind of confusion. That's why I say, Madam President, elections have consequences. And I want to say to the people of Nevis number 4, and when the time comes around, I'm asking them to grant me a little favor, to change the change. That's all I'm asking. Change the change. Because this confusion and this lack of understanding as to the important role that a leader of a major political party on Nevis plays, like, they don't understand it, can't comprehend it. Madam President, we have, I believe, a number of other ordinances that there ought to be some consultation with the leader of the opposition. Are we going to be back in this parliament next week to amend? Because those on the other side can't get their act together? Are we going to wait, Madam President, until the country is in a major crisis where the leader of government has to consult with the leader of the opposition to bring relief to the people of Nevis. I am simply saying to them, get their act together. This is serious business, you know, Madam President. Madam, this amendment to this legislation, Madam President, is unfortunate. And unfortunate in the sense that we really ought not to have been here. And I look at the language, and I believe that the good folks at the legal department had difficulty in drafting this piece of amendment. How can we fashion an amendment to an ordinance, Madam President, to try and cover for the inability, Madam President, of those on the other side to get the act together? That is what we are trying to do. Trying to do the right thing, but at the same time, we are trying to ensure that we position the ordinance in such a way that the ordinance can be effective, Madam President. Madam President, I got in a little late this morning because I was at a function with the Japanese ambassador. And when I came in, I saw a good friend of mine outside with a placard. Start early. And I spot a word on the placard, Madam President, unconstitutional. I wonder if I should go down that road here. I wonder if I should. What I would say, Madam President, let me say this, that the member for Nevis number 2 is not unconstitutional, because after the election of December 12th, I know that I had to have a conversation, Madam President, with the Deputy Governor General.
Me too.
Advising the Deputy Governor General that I support the gentleman to be the Premier of the country.
Me too.
When we look on the other side, I believe that the Deputy Governor General is still waiting. Still waiting after almost 12 months for somebody to say to her that they have the support to be the leader of the opposition. So when they're talking about unconstitutional, not on this side, let them look on that side over there. Madam President, I believe that it is really unfortunate that we are in this parliament to deal with this particular amendment. I agree with our leader. It is as a result of the failure of leadership of the NRP. I agree, Madam President, with the good professor that it is as a result of the inability to compromise, Madam President. And I agree, Madam President, with the member for number 5, that some people come into things that they don't understand. And that is why we are here trying to nudge them to do their job and to do what they ought to do. I will end, Madam President, by once again saying to the people of St. James's number 4, I don't know them to be confusion people. So when the time comes, make sure that the change is changed, Madam President. Thank you, and may it please you.